just like this, just kind of goes like,
yeah.
bloop, 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 bloop. So,
We ran out of words.
yeah.
This is the second field test in a row that's seen us with the Fezzari, the last time being at the Budget Bike Getaway in Tucson, Arizona. But this time around, we're in Bellingham, Washington with Enduro bikes, and the new Sal Peak ain't exactly a budget bike. Carbon fiber from front to back, the purple Fezzari sports 170 millimeters of rear wheel travel via a horsed link layout and a massive carbon linkage that compresses a Fox Float X2 shock. There's also 170 millimeters of travel up front, but the frame is ready for a 200 millimeter dual crown fork if you are. Thinking about going to a 27.5 inch rear wheel? No problem. You can convert it to a mullet setup thanks to a geo-adjusting flip chip that can correct the geometry. Our top of the line Sal Peak test bike retails for $8,500 American via their consumer direct website. Now that's a lot of money no matter who you are, but while it's not a budget bike, it sure does compare favorably spec-wise compared to some of the others on test. In this case, ours came with an Axis drivetrain, Fox factory suspension, and carbon fiber wheels. Let's talk to the test riders to see how the fancy Fezzari performed on the trail. All right, so we've covered the details on the Purple People Eater. We got to talk about how this thing rides, and of course, we start with climbing. Alicia, let's start with pedaling performance first. How does this compare to the other bikes? What do you think?
So this bike is actually the most trail bike feeling of the bunch in that it is fairly lightweight. It's 34.9 pounds, which in the context of these bikes is pretty light and actually rides lighter than the weight would say. And so it pedals uphill really well. It's extremely comfortable. And so it's one of those bikes where you can just point it up anything and be pretty content at the pace you're going. It feels like it can pretty much go anywhere.
Yeah, you've definitely mentioned that a few times. Like, it feels like the most trail bikey of the bunch, which definitely probably makes it better suited to a lot of places where there's some more pedaling and that kind of stuff. Kaz, what do you think are the ingredients that make it feel like that?
This has some shorter chain stays,
Yeah.
so that kind of helps with the kind of get the back end around a little bit quicker. We mentioned the weight. It's kind of a combination of things. The head angle is, it's right in line with all the other ones, 64 degrees, but that is a ½ degree difference than some of the even slacker bikes.
Small amount,
which
but
is a tiny
I mean,
bit,
it's
but that kind of
packaged,
adds
though,
up. Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Like I don't
Yeah.
think most people can notice a ½ degree difference. At least that's my theory. But when you combine that with the little shorter chain stays and the steep seat angle, it just kind of gives it a good all-around feel. I will say that the pedaling performance, like as far as how efficient it feels, it's a little bit softer off the top, a little more active. So this one and I think the Patrol are also on the more active side. So if you really stand up and kind of crank on the pedals, you might notice it moving a bit. But there's still enough support that it doesn't feel like you're wallowing. And there's also a climb switch on that Float X2, super easy to reach. So if you got a big, long fire road climb, you can flip that. It's not like you have to reach down super far. So yeah, overall kind of like middle of the road with efficiency, but combined with the kind of the way that the bike sort of feels light, and does a pretty decent job climbing.
Okay.
I also want to add, Kaz did mention that it's a little more of an active climber, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Where we've been riding where it's a little muddy, it's a little slippery, and that heightened sensitivity off the top also means that the bike has really good traction on the climbs.
All right, Kaz, before we get to the descending part of the review, it sounds like this bike is a good bike for someone who does a lot of pedaling. Would you agree with that? And wants something that's, I mean, we say it, I've said this word too much, but versatile, right?
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't feel like a big dumb bike. We have a couple that I put in the big dumb bike category, which I like.
In a good way.
Yeah, exactly.
In a good way.
Like I like those kind of bikes. With this bike, you're less likely to feel overbike. You could ride some mellower trails and not feel like, I wonder why I brought this bike. This is silly. So it lets you get away with a little bit wider range of trail options without feeling like you brought too much.
Which is actually super interesting because at 170 millimeters, both front and rear, it's tied for the biggest bike in the test. It just doesn't quite feel that way. Like Kaz says, you're not gonna feel overbiked.
Okay, let's talk about going down the hill. Let's stick with suspension performance. Kaz, what did you make of the rear suspension on this bike?
So on the descents, that traction that we talked about on the climbs kind of carries over. So pretty good small bump sensitivity. Again, we've been riding a lot of wet, slippery trails. This hugs the ground really well. It's not stuck to the ground, so you can still kind of hop and play around, but it's less likely to lose traction because of any lack of sensitivity.
Alicia, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think It's sensitive enough that it keeps traction really well. It's great for, like, my first ride on it was actually in the desert, and through a bunch of desert chop, it felt great. And then when we took it to the Northwest, similarly, it kept that traction.
Okay. What about the other end of the stroke as well? We do have one or two bikes here where it sounds like they're almost too progressive. Did you ever feel that with the Fezzari?
Yeah, I would not say the Fezzari is too progressive at all. I think that it's pretty well supported on small and medium bumps, so you're not blowing through the travel, but when you do have those hard hits, it did sometimes get a little overwhelmed to the point where I had one harsh bottom out. I didn't feel like I was bumping into the ramp up very often.
So it feels like it's using its travel well anyway, well managed.
Yeah, I think on the vast majority of trails, for what most people are riding most of the time, it feels very pleasant and just balanced.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's coil compatible too. Like there is enough
true.
progression in the kinematics that you could run a coil shock and it should be fine. If you ended up bottoming out too much, you could probably put a volume spacer in there if you're riding it super hard. But I do think it does have enough progression for a wide range of shocks.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like it strikes a nice middle ground, which brings us to the handling. And I mean, I kind of heard you say the same thing about the handling out on the trail too. Like it's kind of medium, a middle ground where it works.
Yeah, it's kind of harder sometimes with bikes like this where it's almost an extra medium. It just kind of does everything pretty well, pretty neutral. It's not as exciting necessarily to talk about, but I think for a lot of people that don't want to have to struggle to get used to a bike's handling, this can be a good option.
Yeah.
You can hop on it, you feel comfortable right away. It's not super long, so it's pretty versatile for what it is.
Yeah. What did you make of the Fezzari in the corners, Alicia?
Again, I don't want to keep saying medium, but it's not the quickest handling of the bunch. It's also not slow by any means. It's pretty light and fairly agile for a 170 bike, and so it'll change direction quickly. You can lean it over and sort of pop out of corners a little bit.
What happens though when it gets really fast and rough? Because I look at the numbers on this thing and yeah, it's only half a degree steeper, but the head angle is what I'm talking about, but it all adds up. It's got, I think, some shorter chainstays of the group.
The shortest of the group.
The shortest of the group. So what does that translate to on the trail?
So it's not as stable as some of the others at high speed. It doesn't feel unstable necessarily. Like I didn't feel limited until I actually put it against the clock and realized I was riding slower than on the others. We'll talk about that in the time testing section, but yeah, it just doesn't quite have the same length and like rock crushiness. That's not a word, but you know what I mean?
We just made it a word.
No, we didn't.
Oh, we can. I like rock crushiness.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just doesn't power through things just the same way as, some of the longer bikes on test. That said, it'll hold a line reasonably well and it's not pinging off of stuff either.
One thing that I heard you mention out on the trail is that it requires maybe just a little bit more attention when you get going fast.
Yeah, I think some bikes you don't have to think about your line as much, and this one, you do pick your line just a little bit more than on some of the, the really big bikes that'll make you feel overbiked on the flats. This one, you don't feel overbiked on the flats, but on the rowdy stuff, you do have to pay more attention.
Kaz, what do you think?
Yeah, I think for me, it goes to the chainstays being a little bit short. The chainstays are the same across the board, so I think it could be good balance for some of the sizes, but some of the bigger sizes might feel not quite as balanced. We're talking about a 485 millimeter reach with 437 millimeter chainstays, which isn't crazy. Like they're on the shorter side, but there's other bikes with those numbers. But what it does just feels like at those higher speeds, sometimes it's a little easier to break traction from the rear end.
Right.
I mean, not quite as centered. So that can be a benefit in that it can make it have that quicker handling, but we're talking about stability here, and I do think that decreases the stability a bit. Like compared to the common saw that we have, that's a mullet setup, so that has a smaller rear wheel, but it still has pretty long chainstay, so that bike just feels like it wants to track and plow. For this one, just got to focus a little bit more, maybe a little easier for it to get knocked offline.
Right. So it sounds like the Fezzari is pretty well-rounded, and you talked about the transition. I know it's slacker, I know it's got the smaller rear wheel, it's probably maybe a little more aggressive bike, but can you compare these two bikes? Because you also said that transition was pretty versatile as well too. Which would you prefer, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, it's hard to say which one I'll prefer because that really depends on the terrain and what I'm using it for. But the Fezzari is definitely the one that'll pedal a little bit better. They weigh in the same ballpark, but the Fezzari, it just rides light. And so I would choose that over the Patrol for kind of undulating trail systems and a little more up and down, a little more, not cross country, but a little less aggressive downhill, whereas the Patrol feels a little more purpose oriented. Even with that rear wheel being smaller, the chainstays are a little longer than on the Fezzari. And so it does feel like it'll just carry speed a little more aggressively, and you can ride it just a little more aggressively too.
All right, that brings us to talking about component highs and lows, of course. And Kaz, I want you to start off with the stuff that you liked.
Yeah, I'd say the brakes, those TRP brakes, we talked about them on the Patrol. They're just the DH Evo version, super powerful, nice and consistent. Just really like kind of like overall how they work, where the bike comes on. So it's nice to see those. Also has high-end POC suspension, that 38 combined with the X2. You get that on a bunch of bikes, but it doesn't take long to set it up. And I think it's a really nice, very adjustable and works well.
What about the GX axis? Did you like that on this bike?
Yeah, I think actually this is a killer build, and Fezzari is kind of interesting in that you can cherry pick a lot of the parts directly from Fezzari. And so you can really decide where you want to spend your money and where you'd rather save it. I think overall, this bike that we got, it's not exactly one of the stock builds, but you can piece it together from the options on the website. And it is such good value. Like, you get killer parts on this bike. I'm going to second those TRP brakes. They're so good.
Did you have any issues with any parts?
No, honestly, like, I'm just looking at my notes because I'm trying to think, and I wrote question mark, question mark, question mark, because I would really have to nitpick. Even the grips were really good.
Yeah, so they've done a good job of speccing this thing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. It's pretty quiet too. Like, we didn't talk about the frame details that much, but they have the way their cables are run through, that has a little thing that stops them from sliding. So it keeps them from round. That's what makes a lot of noise in some of these other bikes. The dropper post just kind of slides back and forth, but this one is fixed. The little ports work well. So yeah, nicely, the little details are actually well taken care of on this.
Yeah, the bottle cage actually has maybe the most room out of all the others. You can fit a really tall bottle in there. The frame details are just well thought out.
All right, we're gonna talk times, of course. It's a field test. We always do time testing. How did the Fezzari fare for you, Alicia?
This was actually a really interesting one for me in that the Fezzari placed 7th out of 7. So I was in that last spot. It didn't feel slower. It's actually one of those bikes where I felt like I was going reasonably quick, and it wasn't until we looked at the times that it became clear it just didn't, like, I felt like I was kind of pushing at the edge of where, you know, my ability meets the bike's ability. And I hit that edge a little slower than on the other bikes.
Why do you think that is?
I think it just doesn't quite have that same aggressive edge as some of these other bikes. I mean, some of these bikes make you want to push hard, and the Fezzari, when you push it hard, it doesn't feel like it has that much to push against. And so you're trying to carry momentum, and it's just a tiny bit soft. Like, the Fezzari is an incredibly comfortable bike to ride. It feels good in almost everything, and the comfort is really what I keep going back to with it, where it's easy, the handling is really intuitive. But I think there's a little bit of a trade-off with that comfort, where it just doesn't have that racy feel as some of the other bikes.
Kaz, how did the timing go for you?
Yeah, for me, this ended up kind of mid-pack. It was 4th out of 7. That's kind of how it felt. You know, it doesn't have the effortless speed that something like that Contour or the Deviate, like those bikes, I just felt like I could let it run. There wasn't like an upper end. And it didn't, like, I didn't necessarily feel slow on it, but it did take a little more work to really, like, just to allow it to run in some of the choppier sections. Our test track had some kind of like repeated roots and bumps and kind of had to stay on your line. So again, I don't think it's a hard bike to ride, but it's just not the easiest bike to totally trust it to go like full race pace.
All right, we're talking models and pricing now. This is not an inexpensive bike. Compared to one or two of the other bikes here, though, it definitely looks like it's a reasonable value. But what other models are there, Kaz?
The models for this start right around $4,000, all with carbon frames, and then they go all the way up to $8,500. But Fezzari's consumer direct model does give them kind of an edge against some of these other companies where they have kind of pick the different parts, and then the actual final price is lower. Even at that $8,500 model, it's really expensive, but it's got the same parts that you would get from a bike from Santa Cruz. That would be, you know, in the $11,000 range. So yeah, there is value to be had there, even though, you know, I wouldn't consider $8,000 to be a value bike, but what you're getting, the parts for the price, is pretty good.
Yeah, I think it's really worth kind of highlighting that customization piece, where Fezzari takes an interesting approach where on the website you essentially pick your starting point and then can swap out parts from there. So you end up building a bike that's almost fully custom to suit your needs and your budget.
All right, we're almost done with the Fezzari review, but first we're gonna talk pros and cons. Kaz, I wanna hear about the stuff that you liked first.
We've mentioned the versatility of this bike as being a strong point, and I think that's definitely a pro. You know, it can do a wide range of things, whether you're hitting a bike park or racing. It does all those things. It might not be the most purebred race bike, the most purebred park bike, but it can get them all done. But another thing is the fact that the frame itself is pretty customizable. You can put a 27.5-inch rear wheel on there. It's got a little flip chip so that will adjust the geometry. It's dual crown compatible. So I think having those options is kind of neat. You can really make the bike how you'd like it to be.
Alicia, can you tell me about the stuff that you didn't like so much?
I mean, Kaz kind of touched on it there, where its versatility is great for a lot of people, but that also means that it's not going to excel at all of the specific things. And so the fact that it's so well-rounded means so many people can get on it and feel right at home. That said, it's not the world's stiffest frame, it's not the raciest frame, and so some people looking for something extremely specific, like a bike that they're only going to race super rowdy enduros on, or a bike that they're only going to do the bike park on, may want to look elsewhere because this is such a generalist and so good at a wide variety of things.
All right, and we're gonna wrap this up by talking about who this bike best suits, and Kaz, I want you to tell me that.
I think this bike is for somebody that wants a lot of travel. You know, we haven't mentioned it a ton, but it's a 170 mil bike. So if you want to have that much travel, but something you can still pedal, maybe take on a road trip to different areas, I think it can work well for that. So someone that likes having a lot of travel, but doesn't want to feel like they always need to be just pinning it down the steepest, gnarliest downhill track.
All right, that is it for the Fezzari Sal Peak. The thing sounds like an adaptable, versatile bike. Tell us what you think of this thing in the comments below, and make sure to stick around for plenty more videos, including the reviews, the roundtables, and of course, the Huck to Flat.
Yeah.